Good morning, everyone. Welcome to FSMA Fridays, brought to you by SafetyChain Software and the Acheson Group. Today's topic will be FDA access to records under FSMA. Today, I will be your host, Jill Bender. Nice to meet everyone. I'm the VP Marketing Communications with SafetyChain. And before we get started, I just want to bring up a few housekeeping tips regarding today's session. If you're having any technical issues, you can call WebEx Direct. The number is 877-509-3239. And of course, you can always just listen to the audio, and the recording slides will be sent by Monday. We are taking questions. However, it's online only, so you can put your questions anytime into the Q&A tab, and we will get to those at the end of the questions that we're reviewing. And then, of course, for your privacy, all the people online with us today, the names will not be shown. So we have quite a few people. We look forward to today's session. And of course, we have the tag team. We have David Acheson on the call with us. Good morning, David.
Good morning.
Good morning. And then also Jennifer McIntyre is joining us today. So thank you for joining us. Before we get started, we were just chatting a little bit about how we hit our one-year anniversary last month with this. The momentum's been incredible. We have almost close to 2,000 participants. So clearly, we see the value of this, and we're glad that everyone joins us. And again, thank you so much, David, Jennifer, and your team for making this all happen. So with that, let's go ahead and get started, and I'll take us into full screen here. So David, why don't you kick us off here? Tell us what's the latest and greatest with FSMA.
Well, thank you, Jill, and as always, great pleasure to be with everybody today. Not a whole lot to report on the latest and greatest from FSMA, but there's a couple of minor updates. I think that the first one is just a technical one. As everybody knows, the comment period on virtually every rule is closed out, but FDA has extended sanitary transportation comment out to July 30th, so we got a little bit longer on that one. So that's still out for comment. And then I think the other update is that the agency did release that was about a 9-page document on how they propose to implement the Food Safety Modernization Act. My read of that is that it really didn't tell me anything that hasn't already been discussed, or it wasn't that new, or I don't think unexpected turns and twists. But it did emphasize the reliance that the agency is going to be placing on third parties. And by that, I include foreign governments, I include state inspectors domestically, and the role of the third-party audits for imported foods, which, again, reading in between the lines is telling me that they've absolutely recognized that they cannot get this lift done on their own. And I think this bodes well for alignment with schemes like GFSI moving forward, albeit that they haven't specifically acknowledged that yet, and we don't have that lined up. But that's my interpretation of this, and I think that's the main take-home here is, they're serious. They're going to make this happen, but they realize they've got to leverage a combination of state inspectors domestically, foreign governments, as well as the whole third-party audit program to make it effective. So those are the updates, Jill. So see what happens in the next month.
Yeah, always something new, isn't there? Well, let's go ahead and move on to sort of the focus from today's our topic, FDA access to records. And we have a few pre-submitted questions. Jennifer, why don't you take us through the next one? What does FSMA change in terms of FDA's access to the records?
Sure. So I think the best way to discuss this is to talk about the access that FDA had to records pre-FSMA. The pre-FSMA, in order for FDA to access records, they needed a reasonable belief that that food would be adulterated and present a threat of serious adverse health consequences or death to humans or animals, the SACODA standard. So it was a reasonable belief, and it was for that particular food. Here, the bar has been lowered so that the access to records has been expanded. Now, FDA needs a reasonable probability that the use of or exposure to this food or any other articles of food that FDA reasonably believes is likely to have been affected in a similar manner would cause those serious adverse health consequences. So FDA reasonably believes is likely to be affected. What does that mean? And FDA says in the Federal Register notice that this will be determined on a case-by-case basis. So one of the things that FDA has also said is that they do use this records access to help them determine if there is that reasonable probability that this food or related food, similar food produced in that facility, food produced on that same equipment, if that too could be affected. So it really expands the scope of what they can look at and the types of foods that they can look at that they may have reason to believe could be adulterated, as well as lowers that threshold, lowers the standard for records access.
Oh, interesting. Okay, well let's talk a little bit about why this happened. David, if you want to go ahead and share sort of why it happened, and more importantly, when is the FDA likely to exercise its authority? Oops, are you still there, David? David, I think we might have lost you. Jennifer, are you still there?
Yes.
Okay, it looks like David's line.
I can share some stories that David has shared with me.
Okay, great.
So David has mentioned situations when FDA has gone into a facility, sees a piece of equipment, for example, that was clearly not functioning properly, and knew that the food produced in that piece of equipment was probably adulterated. But within this facility, there were other pieces of equipment, basically the same style, same type, under the same conditions, but FDA didn't have the authority to go ahead and investigate further those other parts of the facility and the other foods that intuitively probably had a problem as well. But legally, FDA's authority was very limited to looking at very particular issues, very specific circumstances. And so from a very practical standpoint, the authority that existed before FSMA and its limitations really did limit FDA's ability to protect public health. And so this expanded records access happened. The reason that it happened was to give FDA those opportunities when they just knew that something was wrong, to be able to look a little bit forward. And broader. There are a couple of other examples that FDA cites when plant managers have refused FDA access to records that probably would have given the agency more pause and created more concern, and perhaps the agency would have taken additional regulatory action. But when plant managers refused access to records that FDA asked for, and FDA, from a legal standpoint, just couldn't force them to turn these records over. That's where there have been, in real life, some challenges. So the question you asked, well, so what's going to happen in the future? How might this change?
Right. And I see David online with us, too, again. So thank you, David. But no, I'm sorry. Keep going, Jennifer.
Oh, then David is definitely better positioned than me to address this question. So I will turn it over to him.
David,
I'm sorry about that, everybody. I don't.
Authority.
I apologize. Some glitch in cell phone. I missed obviously exactly what Jennifer said, but one of the reasons this happened was pre-FSMA, FDA was having to leverage the Bioterrorism Act on a regular basis to get at the records that they felt they needed to get access to, and that was a cumbersome process. It required high bars to be met, and obviously they reduced that bar significantly. And we're already seeing that the FDA is leveraging this authority, and I think we're going to continue to see that. So, given that this is a piece of the Food Safety Modernization Act that is effective today, it was effective as of when it was signed into law in January 2011. There's a fairly low bar, as I know we've discussed already, for this, and they're going to leverage it, and we're going to see them, I think, start pulling on loose threads, and if these threads start to come undone, then they'll be going for the next set of records and the next set of records within a facility. So bottom line here is the bar is unquestionably lowered. Be ready with your records to be able to provide them to FDA immediately.
Right. Okay, great. And David, when you did drop off, Jennifer gave some really good examples of, talking about why this change is happening. So perfect. So moving on.
Good.
Now we'll take this question. Jennifer, if you want to take this question, does the FDA need to issue some formal request, or what is the process?
Sure. So the answer is yes. As David mentioned, previously they had to invoke the Bioterrorism Act. Currently, it needs to be somebody from FDA. They have to present their credentials. They do have to provide written notice of what exactly they're asking for, what those records are. So you will have that documentation delivered by an official from FDA. In terms of how long then you have to provide those records, for the most part, it's within 24 hours. That's the standard that was set for the Bioterrorism Act, for example, for traceability requirements, and that has not changed. It has not been shortened yet. The other question you've got up here, do they have to be submitted in any particular format? Do they have to be electronic? No. The answer is no. They do need to be available on site for the FDA representative to photocopy or reproduce somehow. But that doesn't mean they must be electronic, and it doesn't prevent them or prohibit a company from keeping records electronically. Electronic records are still considered on-site records as long as they can be accessed from within that facility. So FDA has not specified any particular format for these records. It's what the company has, but they do need to be made available as quickly as possible and within 24 hours of receiving that written request.
Okay, so ease of access of your records is going to be important here. And that's interesting with the 24 hours. I think you mentioned that's been the standard, correct, so far. But you did mention yet, so it sounds like
and this is not because there's any authority that Congress has granted FDA to change that, but more just my personal observation and perspective that 24 hours is an awfully long time when there is that threat of a serious adverse health consequence. So the sooner the better, for sure.
And certainly companies are responding a lot quicker than 24 hours, so it seems to make sense. Okay, great. So moving on to the next question, and David, I'll loop this one back to you, and we have a little more data on this slide here, but what can the FDA ask for versus, is there a list? Where can people look for this?
Yeah, there is a list. The FDA's put out guidance documents, and you basically just popped it up there on the screen. Perfect. So effectively the way to view this is that FDA can get at pretty much anything and everything that you have, but there are some exceptions which we can get to in just a second. But all of your manufacturing records and your incoming ingredient records, your testing records, your consumer complaint records, distribution lists, anything that they would perceive as being something that is related to the manufacturing or processing of the product, the recipient of the ingredients, the distribution of the product, and all of the things that link to that. Some folk are not aware that they can get hold of complaints, adverse event complaints, which they can. And the truth is they could always get all of this stuff through the Bioterrorism Act. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, that was a cumbersome process, and this has made it a lot easier for the agency to get hold of all of this stuff. But there are some important things to remember that they are not able to get. And around that is that they have never had access to personnel records. They don't have access to financial records. And they don't actually have access to your recipes. And as you can see now on the other half of the slide, there's specifically a component of the Code of Federal Regulations that's referenced there around recipes. So this is an area that makes food companies very nervous. Well, can they get at our recipes? Those are proprietary. We don't want to give those to FDA because we don't know what they're going to do with them. And the concern is this is all accessible through the Freedom of Information Act. And the reality is that it is not all accessible. FDA has requirements to keep commercial confidential information from a company, a food company, safe. They have to protect it, but they're not legally allowed to have access to your recipes. Now, they can ask you maybe what's the percentage of ingredient X that you use in your formulation. If ingredient X is the one where there's been a concern, I think that's fair game. My read of this is that what they cannot do is get the information from you that would allow either somebody in the agency or somebody who got hold of that data to basically reproduce your recipes. But outside of that, personnel financing, and there's some limitations on farms and restaurants. But if you take financing, personnel, and these important recipes out of the mix, pretty much everything else they've got access to, which, as I said before, they could under the Bioterrorism Act. This has just made it a lot easier for them to get.
Okay, and it sounds like, again, timing-wise, 24 hours, so a lot of information.
Absolutely.
Ready access to, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep, 24 hours. Yep.
Great, thanks, David. And I think sort of following on to what you had started to talk to, and Jennifer, if you want to go ahead and take it, just in regards to the terms of the confidentiality. So that's a lot of records that they can have access to. What, how do you view as far as the FDA's ability to maintain that confidentiality?
And David did start to address this. Companies
right.
are concerned about providing records to FDA and who's going to get a hold of them, and are competitors going to get a hold of them, and is the information going to be redacted appropriately and all that. And these are understandably valid concerns, but as David mentioned, FDA does have to abide by their information disclosure requirements. There is FOIA, and so some of this material could be, some of these records or portions of the records may be accessible through that Freedom of Information Act request, but FDA does have that responsibility to protect commercial confidential information, to redact information that in accordance with their own requirements. So the agency does recognize that there is this non-public information. That said, they can share some of the more sensitive information with other federal authorities, with state, local governments, foreign governments. So there are allowances for them to share this information pretty much in full. But in terms of what the public would have access to, no, FDA does maintain the confidentiality of that information.
So the assumption then, when they're sharing documents through the government agencies, again, the same form of protection is still there.
Well, you would hope. I am not as sure, and maybe David could comment about when, if records leave the U.S. and go to foreign governments, I don't know what authorities then would protect those records. And so that's a question that I have that I would pitch to David.
Yeah, well, I think I wouldn't have a lot of confidence that they'll necessarily be safeguarded, which is why you don't want to provide anything that's really important to the business, like the financials and the recipes, and
right.
the law in the United States protects you from that anyway. But I know from experience that the inspectors will ask for this. They will ask for things, and food companies that are feeling a little bit under the pressure during an inspection, particularly if it's a full-cause inspection, they're wanting to appease the inspector. They want to give them what they're asking for, and they may just provide stuff and they, oops, shouldn't have done that. But again, my experience has been push back. You can say, sorry, you're not allowed this. I'm not going to share this with you because it contains our proprietary recipes. And my read of the law is that you're not allowed to get that. And 9 times out of 10, the inspector will say, okay, thanks, and move on.
And that makes sense, right?
Yeah, and they're going in there saying, we want to get everything we can. Give us everything that you'll give us. And some companies are willing to give everything, kitchen sink included, and sometimes that can get you into trouble. So just keep that in mind as this records access it continues to gain traction.
And that goes back to when you get audited, right? Knowing what having the whole organization know what can be accessible, it sounds like.
Right.
Good. Okay. Well, we do have, that was sort of the pre-submitted questions that we have. Of course, now it's time for questions from the audience, and there are a good few that have already came in, and so let me go ahead and take us out of full screen. So for those who are online versus just calling in, you can go ahead and submit questions in the right-hand corner, the Q&A tab, and we'll just go ahead and get started on some of the ones that have come in. Let me take a look at those, and I'll have either one of you sort of pipe up if you want to take it. We have, it looks like some of these actually have already been addressed, but I'll throw some of these out here. Mark is asking, will the FDA ever request records outside of the on-site visit or inspection?
Yes, they can. Certainly, it may get triggered by an on-site inspection, but it wouldn't be unusual is during that they gain access to a certain number of records and they start to look at those, and then they get a call or back, and it's like, well, can you give us this, and this, because we would like to get that. So, you know, it typically starts with the on-site, but it doesn't typically end there as the agency starts to review the records. They think they've got other questions. So you can expect to get follow-up requests through email or phone calls for other things.
Okay, so typical follow-up as opposed to the onset of questions. Okay. Jennifer, oh, I'm sorry. Did you want to pipe in with a little more on that?
Well, I was going to say there are examples in some states where they forgo the on-site visit for that initial request, especially if they're doing a traceback investigation and they need those types of records. If they know the facility where they need to get these records from, they may not, from the state level, some have found it more efficient to not take the time to physically travel there, and they'll call and explain the situation and make a request that way, and then maybe follow up. But given that time is of the essence in some of these situations, at least at the state level, they've used other mechanisms to acquire these records aside from just that initial on-site visit, knock on the door.
Okay, great. So a follow-up question is in regards to employee handwritten notes or files. Does the FDA have access to those?
Yes, they do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it falls under the same bucket that I was talking about earlier of what they have access to and what they do not have access to. If you've got notes around production, corrective actions, consumer complaints, and it's all handwritten, yeah, they do. I mean, if it's notes around recipes, no. So there's nothing that I'm aware of that speaks to the nature of the record. Whether it's handwritten, whether it's printed, whether it's electronic. They're kind of silent on that. It's more what it covers, where the access begins and ends. So assume that if you sort of annotate something, you've got maybe a printout from a piece of equipment, or it's a chart that's been filled out with readings and measurements, and head of quality or somebody else has put a comment on it about why the heck didn't somebody catch this? We really screwed up today. Hopefully nobody would do that. Then I would see the FDA could get that, and you probably would think, I wish Joe hadn't written that on there because we just shot us in the foot. So yeah, be careful. Be careful.
So we'll keep Jill out of the plants, is what you're saying.
Well, yeah, no, I raising awareness is a lot of what this is about. Is just understanding. Yeah, this can get scope creep pretty badly, and they can get into all kinds of things.
And again, that goes back to sort of the education and training of employees, bottom up, right? On that component.
It really does. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yep. Okay, great. Moving on to a couple other questions that have come in. Do state inspectors have the same authority as the FDA regarding records?
Who has the same authority?
Oh, state inspectors?
State. Okay. Jennifer, were you about to answer that?
I was going to say, no, not necessarily the same authority. In some cases, because the states have their own authorities. We saw in the PCA, Peanut Corporation of America, that the FDA was able to use the fact that the state had more authority to do things that FDA at that time couldn't do. So the states may have different authorities. They may vary state to state, but I think that there are some general authorities across the board, FDA and states, but certainly there are variations.
Yeah, and I'm not exactly the one thing I'd add, and you know, if anybody on the phone listening to us has got examples contrary to this, it'd be good to educate everybody. But I'm not aware that any state has access to the same to the financials and the personnel records, at least not under the food safety umbrella. Yeah, they can subpoena them for other reasons, but I'm not aware that any state can get that information as part of a food safety investigation. But I certainly don't know all nuances in all 50 states. So if anybody knows different, then let's educate me and everybody else. So that would be just a good question to put out more broadly.
Okay, great. And if people want to put that in terms of the questions, that would be great, or certainly could email us afterwards. And as you know, each month we continue the dialogue from the previous month often, so that's a good thing to input to have. Moving on to a couple other questions here, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. The top of the hour, the bottom of the hour is coming quickly. This might be a little bit of a can of worms, but I'll go ahead and put it out there because we're not shy of topics here. Jose is asking, so just to confirm, and again, I don't know if we'll get the right, we'll get, if you all will know the correct answer, I'm sure you'll have your thoughts. Under the Freedom of Information Act, records that were copied by the FDA will eventually go public after some time.
They don't necessarily, no.
Okay.
I mean, the FDA has, and it depends a little bit on the nuance of the question. And if the investigation is active, then it's typically nobody can get access to it. You know, the FDA say this is an ongoing investigation. No, you cannot, Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA, as we call it. You know, you cannot FOIA this information because the investigation is ongoing and active. Once the investigation is closed, then that information is available. But if the question is it available, the answer is yes. If the question is, does it automatically get posted somewhere, pre-redacted, the answer is no.
Good. Okay. That's got to be a good relief for most of us out there. Sarah's asking, if the FDA is utilizing the third-party auditing, will they have the same access as FDA?
That's a really good question. Well, we have to remember that the third-party audit process under FSMA is designed exclusively for the issuance of certificates around either high-risk foods or voluntary qualified importer program. Those are the only two areas where a third-party audit certificate is relevant. Third-party audits can be used as part of the foreign supply verification program. It's not a requirement. This is a different animal than an inspection based on a reasonable probability that your food has caused a serious adverse health event. I do not see any situation where if the agency thinks somebody's food has been associated with a serious adverse health event, that they will be sending in a third-party auditor to do any of this. So I'd say no. It's a different animal, and I'm just trying to differentiate apples and from oranges here because the role of the third-party auditor is a very different one than the role we're talking about here, which is records access as a result of an event. Now, I will add a caveat to that and say that as part of a routine inspection, not for cause, not serious adverse health event, as part of a routine inspection, the FDA can get access to records that support your implementation of the food safety plan. They're not there yet because that's not all final and finished off. But as we look towards 2016, routine inspection, FDA comes in and says, show me your food safety plan, show me the records that you're implementing your food safety plan. Now that doesn't get into all the nuances and details that we've been talking about, but it can cover a fair amount of it. And I would say that the third-party auditor could ask for the same information if they're trying to certify your facility that you have met criteria for high-risk foods. So on the one hand, it's sort of black and white. If it's a for cause, that won't be third parties. If it's for the purposes of a routine inspection around do you have a food safety plan and are you implementing it, then yeah, I think third parties will get access to those kinds of bits of information around risk control, which is part of the mandate of them being able to issue a certificate to say you're controlling that risk. Bit of a complicated answer, but hopefully people were tracking with me on that.
No, absolutely. And with that, we do have just one or two more questions, if you both could stay on just for a few more minutes, though I do want to answer one question that's come up quite a bit, is just in reference to the recording, and absolutely, every FSMA Fridays is recorded. Links are sent out on Mondays, and you absolutely will get that. Also, I did move this slide, if everyone just takes a quick peek. We do have some upcoming events. I think, you know, the June 4th session, that is SafetyChain's product demo, and it really sort of talks about how to be FSMA ready. And when we talked about, you know, access to documents and manage your food safety plan and so forth. So for those who have not had a chance to take a look at what SafetyChain does, there's a great opportunity on the 4th. We'll also be in Chicago coming up at the United Fresh Conference. And certainly if there's more questions, you can always visit our website, SafetyChain.com or the AchesonGroup.com. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and just throw out just a few more questions. We'll wrap up today's session. Beth is asking, can the FDA use information about ingredients to justify access to records? So she's giving an example. If an ingredient was determined to be adulterated in one facility, could they access records at other facilities that purchased that ingredient?
I'm thinking, and I want to say yes. Let me play a scenario out there. If you've used an ingredient that tastes got salmonella in it, and this has popped up through somebody else's, in another facility, and the FDA has discovered you've received that ingredient, then the FDA is going to say, okay, we've got reasonable probability that you received an ingredient, and possibly even credible evidence that you received an ingredient with salmonella in it. We want to go figure out what you did with it. Now, you know, you may be able to knock that out very quickly to say, we cook it. It goes into soup. It gets retorted, not a problem. Or if they then sort of push, and they start to get into the reportable food registry, and which the whole purpose of which is for FDA to do exactly what we're talking about, is to follow up with contaminated ingredients and contaminated products to figure out whether they are themselves have created new risks. So I wouldn't say 100% of the time, but assume the answer is yes. That does, to me, cross the bar. If whatever the contaminant is one that would be associated with a serious adverse health event. Jennifer, do you see it the same way?
I do, and I know that there was another question in the queue about what is a reportable food record, and that is that record that a facility needs to make with FDA, a submission to the agency through the reportable food registry when they have shipped a product or an ingredient that has, or they've received a product or an ingredient that is adulterated. And this is, as David said, what allows the agency to begin to follow that path and understand who else could have received this ingredient. And if it's adulterated, why wouldn't the agency follow up? It seems like it would be in the best interest of public health to understand how that adulterating ingredient was used.
One like nuance to what Jennifer said, and I agree with her, is when she says adulterated in the context of reportable food registry, it is a class 1. It has to be a class 1 serious adverse health event for it to trip the trigger for reportable food registry. And I know sometimes we don't know. We don't know in a situation is this going to turn into a class 1. And, you know, my advice to the companies we work with is, you know, if you're not sure you think it could, then go on the side of caution because the law says you've got 24 hours to report it if you think it might, and you can always pull it back out. But it's not any kind of adulteration that trips the trigger for an RFR. It's basically a class 1 kind of deal.
Okay, and certainly that makes sense. I'm just going to throw one last question at you and sort of follow along this line, so we'll wrap this up if you don't mind. Someone's asking, as a supplier to a food manufacturer that is actually in a food safety incident, could they be pulled into the record requests and investigations occurring at their customer site?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, it's not unusual for it starts out at one place and you got illness linked to a product produced at company X. FDA goes in there, company X hears about it, and they realize, well, you know, it was a pass-through. It wasn't anything to do with us. We simply received a contaminated ingredient, and you bet the FDA will be moving up the supply chain to the supplier, and they'll be next. And they are going in there with credible evidence that supplier shipped an ingredient that a reasonable probability of link to a serious adverse health event. So yes, it just keeps rolling backwards as long as the threads allow it to.
Right. I mean, it makes sense from an investigation standpoint, would have to. Okay,
right, exactly,
well, wow,
yeah.
that were quite a few questions that, as always, wonderful dialogue during these sessions, and thank you, the audience participation, and certainly David and Jennifer for us keeping you on your toes and addressing all these questions. Always appreciated. Thank you. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up today's FSMA Friday sessions. Thank you very much for everyone that's joined us. Next month, we have on board for traceability requirements and best practices. But as always, we sort of shake up the agenda. If there's anything new that's come out, we will move the agendas around to address the newest and latest and greatest with FSMA. So again, thank you, David and Jennifer. Really appreciate it. And thank you for everyone that's joined us today.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you to everybody. And again, apologies for the technical issues I faced, but glad it worked out. Thank you.
Yeah, you came right back on. Thanks.